Arcane Mage feels so much better in 10.1.5. It's actually fun, and I don't know if it's slightly less complicated, but there's definitely a simpler way to play Arcane Mage in AoE, most of all, because that's kind of how we've been able to test out. PTR isn't very accessible with what kind of content that we do. We don't have Mythic Plus and we don't have Raid, so we kind of had to do some Mythic Zeros, but luckily our alts that we played on PTR with didn't have that really high level to like melt Mythic Zeros and completely get a skewed opinion on how the actual plays. So I actually have a good idea of how Arcane feels and plays in AoE, which is really nice, not to mention that the Arcane community, specifically Porom as well, made an article on Wowhead that we do recommend you check out with the first impression of Arcane Mage that I went over as well. It has some really good feedback there. Some things that are a little bit theory crafty too much maybe for this video. So if you want the advanced opinions of Arcane Mage, you can check that out. The link will be in the description. But in terms of Arcane, what actually changed? Well, first of all, the general talent tree have changed a lot. We mentioned these in our initial Mage video, and you can go check that out as well. I'm not gonna spend too much time on it, but I will mention actually a few important things. Probably the most important thing is that Rune of Power is gone, which is fantastic. I think pretty much every mage has been asking for this for years. Not to mention that Frost Mage, I think, in BFA had some builds that ran Encounters Flow and was the happiest mage spec out of all because they didn't have to stay in the Rune of Power. Now it's obviously gone. It's really good. You can definitely take Encounters Flow, for instance, which is at the top of the talent tree. There's a bunch of changes that were made. Shifting Power is also super high up in the talent tree, in the general talent tree, so you don't have to go all the way down. And the capstones have changed drastically. You have Time Anomaly and Temporal Warp at the middle side of the talent tree still there, and there's still some that you can get. It's decently accessible, so it's not that hard to get. Instead of Shifting Power, or rather to the left-hand side of the talent tree, you have a new capstone, which is Ice Cold. Now, I don't remember if I ended up playing with this in the dungeons that we did, because I didn't really take that much damage, but this is definitely a big improvement on Ice Block. You don't have to take this, but if you do end up taking it, you lose the immunity. However, Ice Block will now give you 70% damage reduction for 6 seconds. And that is fantastic because there are situations where you don't just want to immune, you want to, you know, be able to actually not be stuck in a place, because that's usually kind of Ice Block. So it definitely changes your cooldown based on different style of content, because what Ice Cold does, by just, you know, going through the tooltip, Ice Block now reduces all damage taken by 70% for 6 seconds, but no longer grants immunity, prevents movements, attacks, or casting spells. So you can essentially do what Paladins have been doing in their immunities, where you can just cast and move around, but it's no longer an immunity. Now this obviously provides you with different options when it comes to what you want to do in your group. In dungeons, you can probably take one or the other. Likely Ice Cold is gonna be better. Most of the times there's no real mechanics that you want to immune in dungeons that we know of. I don't know, maybe there's like a niche thing. But in raids, definitely you have an option, because usually mages are used for immuning certain mechanics, taking some things out, something that they can soak just on their own, that you can still use your normal Ice Block for it. But if you don't need to immune anything, you can use Ice Cold instead and not be stuck in your Ice Block for the entire duration and still have the damage reduction. Because sometimes you might just want to immune one ability, one tick of damage, and then you can just cancel your Ice Block, or you might want to stay there. But now you also get the full value of a defensive for 6 seconds, not just one tick of damage, which makes you a little bit tankier. Another thing that's really tanky, although not just for you, is the other capstone, which comes with a choice now between Mass Barrier and Mass Invisibility. Just to get it out of the way, Mass Invisibility is a PvP talent that you can take, and you can actually skip in dungeons with it. We did a little bit of a skipping testing, and it's pretty good. It feels like it's some kind of a shroud, but I don't know if it's necessary. We don't really have a lot of skips, but hey, if you want to get tricky and you want to get creative with all of your dungeon routing, you can definitely use Mass Invisibility for some party skips for certain trash, if that's something that you want to. But likely you'll get more value from Mass Barrier, because what Mass Barrier does, especially for Arcane, is it puts Prismatic Barrier on everybody. And Prismatic Barrier, besides the, you know, the soak, it does offer magic damage protection, magic damage reduction, and so on, and you end up putting it on our entire party, which is giga turbo big when it comes to magic damage reduction and helping your party survive certain ticks of mechanics. This could potentially, like I'm thinking from the past season when I've done hierarchies, something like Veximus that was really hard on everybody, taking a lot of damage, and we were rotating cooldowns around, or Croth, for instance, also in Academy, where you had to use a party-wide defensive if you had it to kind of survive certain ticks of damage. Obviously, we have that now as well, but this is definitely going to help you, especially as an Arcane Mage, to protect your party from magic damage once every, I think it's a 5-minute cooldown. It's a 2-minute cooldown, which is pretty good and definitely gives more value to you as a spec, specifically as Arcane, because that's what we're talking about today. And there's a bunch of other nodes swapped around and moved around. The general talent tree is really good. I'm not going to go too much into it right now because I do want to talk about the spec talent tree. Probably the biggest thing that changed for Arcane is the Capstone 4 Orb Barrage, which is what's named right now, or Barrage, which is the all Legion legendary that makes it so that Arcane Barrage has a 10% chance per Arcane charge consumed to launch an Arcane Orb in front of you. What this means is that in big AoE packs, if you fire your Arcane Barrage, you have a chance to just fill up on Arcane charges instantly because you're just going to shoot out an Arcane Orb, and you can essentially do Arcane Barrage into whatever, into like Arcane Explosion, then another Arcane Barrage without having to actually individually build those Arcane charges up. This makes AoE rotation so much better. Not to mention another change that happened specifically for AoE that I felt it was so good to play with is Concentrated Power, way at the top of the talent tree, by the way. Clear casting makes your next Arcane Missiles channel 20% faster, or Arcane Explosion echo for 40% damage. What that means is that Arcane Explosion will hit twice. Obviously, it's less damage on the second one, but it still generates an Arcane charge, and that is fantastic in AoE, because right next to it, really accessible, again, is Reverberate that also has been changed, making if Arcane Explosion hits at least 3 targets, it has a 50% chance to generate an extra Arcane charge. So if you're in big AoE, with the Reverberate, you can probably press one Arcane Explosion, just fill your Arcane charge. I think this happened once or twice for me as well, and it felt fan-freaking-tastic. It's really good. There's a bunch of other talents moved around and changed, which is obviously really good. But what this build does essentially is that outside of your, Radiant Spark windows and your Touch of the Magi windows, you can still actually play an interesting AoE spec without having to manually press Arcane Explosion a bunch of times, build your charges, spend the charges, build the charges, spend the charges, which was the old BFA playstyle that was very memey and very simplistic at the time. Now you actually have some interactions, you have some decisions to make. However, speaking of Radiant Spark, this build does kind of have an issue that I think Porom made a better point in the article, because when I figured it out, I kind of noticed it a little bit too late. When you are in your Radiant Spark window, if you proc some Arcane Orbs just in the middle of you building up your ramp and, the stacks of Radiant Spark, it messes up your damage profile a little bit, which can make the AoE slightly more complicated during the Radiant Spark. Now, I think what Porom mentioned in his article was so that the Arcane Orb procs do not contribute to, getting the stacks of the damage increase from Radiant Spark, so you can properly set up your damage profile. I think that might be something that the devs might be looking into. When I tested it on the PTR, it didn't seem like that happened, so my damage window was all over the place. I was trying to figure it out. It's definitely a little bit weird, and I hope it doesn't overly complicate the AoE, because that's one of the issues that I think Arcane has in AoE right now, especially for new players. A noob player like myself that's not an experienced Arcane Mage, it's a lot to get into, and if I want to learn Arcane, it's a big learning curve, which I'm not usually opposed to, but it's a high barrier of entry, which not a lot of specs have. A lot of specs have some complicated sides to them, but I think Arcane does it a little bit too much, and it is likely, even though the talents have changed and with the rework it feels better, the learning curve or the barrier of entry might be slightly higher for AoE. At least that's kind of how it felt like. And still in single target, from what the theory crafters have devised, the build is fairly similar, but you still don't end up getting Arcane Harmony, which is probably an issue with talent tuning. And I think Arcane is just particularly more difficult to design and tune because of its intricate rotation and cooldown sync, which it's probably still gonna be a thing going on, but at least we're working towards a world where the first bits of the annoying parts of Mage have been taken away, specifically Rune of Power, because you already have to stand a lot with Arcane to be able to do your thing. Not to mention the AoE is a little bit more straightforward and more fluid, it feels better and it's more explosive, and you definitely feel really, like, I feel so much better. I'm just thinking not taking Radiant Spark at all and just have fun by blasting a lot of Arcane Orbs, which I don't know if that's gonna end up being a thing late game, because Arcane Orb is not essentially AoE capped, and I believe Arcane Barrage is still only hitting a set amount of targets. It's capped for sure. But if we go in the world where in AoE you don't take Radiant Spark, I might actually enjoy my Arcane a little bit more, even though I like complicated specs. So maybe this says enough about the spec moving forward into the rework. But at least at the beginning, it's very, very good. The class tree, no, the spec tree rather, definitely gives you more options to play around with some of the talents. You can get a Chrono Shift, you can get Improved Prismatic Barrier, which obviously offers some utility, some defensives, and it's all that good. Having flexibility is really good because it's, and I still think this is not final. This is not final because it reminds me of the balance, and I always make this comparison, balance and shadow talent trees, where you had to sacrifice damage to get utility or survivability. Either you had to sacrifice damage for shadow to be able to get your defensives, or you had to sacrifice damage for Boomkin to get your solar beam, to get your kick, until they fixed it, until they made it so that you don't have to make that choice. And that choice is still present in the arcane tree, and I think they should probably work towards redistributing the points in a way where you don't have to make that choice, where you can just get them, or you can choose between one utility and the other instead of a utility and damage or defensive and damage, because you're always going to go damage. It's a DPS dealer. So once that's aired out, maybe there's going to be more flexibility within the talent tree, because the builds are pretty much set in stone. From what the theory crafters have been devising so far, I think there's like 3 to 4 points difference between single target and AoE, and most of the playstyle remains the same. Now, it's the first step into a great direction, removing a lot of the old style mechanics that are a little bit too old for modern WoW, like Rune of Power, and having proper capstones in the class tree. I think we can take a page out of Paladin's book, where they have probably one of the best class trees, even though they had one of the worst class trees up until recently. And I think Mage is in a good direction. We're looking forward to more changes for Arcane, and of course we're gonna have videos on Fire and Frost as well. This has been a quick coverage on how Arcane feels and plays in the 10.1.5 PTR. Is likely gonna have a bunch more changes by the time the patch actually rolls out. Hopefully Arcane feels a little bit better also, but don't forget to check the links in the description for Porom's actual in-depth discussion about Arcane Mage, and of course you can also check the Arcane Dream Discord, where all the big boys and girls that play Arcane actually do a lot of Arcane cool stuff. Thank you for watching the video. Thank you, patrons, for supporting the content. This is in no small part thanks to you for making this possible for us to be able to do all kinds of videos and give you coverages on future specs and things that happen outside of just our regular TLFs and class guides and things like that. Thank you for watching the video. See you in the next one.
I've been loving it then, I still love it now. Still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. Getting better every day, let me show you how. Cause still, I play WoW. Still, I play WoW. It's getting harder to stay, but at the end of the day, it's a guilty pleasure, so just log in and play. Whether it's classic or retail, I'ma do a /bow. Still, I play WoW.